Something happened in the last 72 hours that most people completely missed. Not the diplomatic maneuvering in Vienna, not the public posturing from Supreme Leader Khamenei, not even the IAEA's latest report on enrichment levels at Fordow. No. What happened is far more consequential to the regime sitting in Tehran. A formal intelligence assessment, stamped and circulated at the highest levels of U.S. Central Command, has been placed on the desk of the National Security Advisor. An assessment that details a systematic dismantling of the Islamic Republic's most cherished strategic assumption. A system that maps, with sub-meter resolution, the one thing Iran's entire deterrent posture depends on remaining hidden. That system is a constellation of satellites operating in low Earth orbit, equipped with synthetic aperture radar and hyperspectral imaging, and if the latest findings are accurate, nothing about this confrontation will look the same on the other side of it. To understand why this assessment is as significant as it is, you have to start with a foundational concept in nuclear strategy and conventional deterrence, the survivability of the second strike capability. For a nation that cannot match the United States in carrier strike groups, in fifth-generation fighter fleets, or in the sheer tonnage of precision-guided munitions, the ability to absorb a first strike and still respond is not a luxury. It is the entire strategy. Iran's military doctrine, refined over 2 decades, rests on a single pillar: the hardened, deeply buried, geographically dispersed facility that cannot be located, and therefore cannot be targeted. Take that away, and the entire edifice collapses. The specific constellation that is doing the taking away is not a single satellite. It is an architecture. A multi-layered, multi-sensor network that combines the constant stare of electro-optical satellites with the cloud-penetrating, soil-penetrating capability of synthetic aperture radar. Synthetic aperture radar does not take pictures. It builds 3-dimensional maps by bouncing radar pulses off the Earth's surface and measuring the return signal with such precision that changes in soil density, the kind created by tunneling and underground construction, show up as distinct anomalies. The U.S. Space Force, in coordination with the National Reconnaissance Office, has been layering this capability over Iranian territory with a revisit rate that is now measured in minutes, not hours or days. Every square meter of the Zagros Mountains, every square meter of the dashed Kavir Desert, every square meter of the coastal plain along the Persian Gulf. Scanned, compared to previous scans, analyzed by algorithms trained to detect the specific thermal, seismic, and geological signatures of subterranean military construction. This is not a marginal improvement in intelligence collection capability. It is a fundamental change in the strategic architecture of the missile threat. The geography matters. It has always mattered. Iran's missile and nuclear program is not distributed randomly across the country. It follows the mountains. The Zagros Range, running northwest to southeast, provides the geological gift of deep granite and limestone formations that can be hollowed out into facilities capable of surviving a direct hit from a 5,000-pound bunker buster. The Alborz Mountains, curling along the Caspian coast, provide a secondary belt of hard rock within striking distance of Tehran. For 20 years, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force has exploited this geology with methodical precision. Tunnel complexes, false entrances, decoy facilities, ventilation shafts hidden in wadis. The entire enterprise was built on a single assumption that Iranian war planners treated as an article of faith: the Americans can see the surface, but they cannot see below it. They can watch the trucks enter the mountain, but they cannot know what happens once the blast doors close. That assumption is now dead. Let that sit for a moment. The specific technical capability that killed it is a sensor package designated as the AN/TPI-4, not in its ground-based configuration, but in a space-hardened variant whose existence was only acknowledged in a single line of a Department of Defense budget justification document 2 years ago. Operating in the X-band frequency, this system achieves a ground resolution of 0.3 meters through cloud cover, through camouflage netting, and through up to 15 meters of reinforced concrete depending on soil composition. When paired with hyperspectral imaging that analyzes the electromagnetic signature of disturbed Earth, the system does not merely see the tunnel entrance. It sees the tunnel, its depth, its length, its internal volume. The specific ventilation requirements of a solid fuel missile storage facility create a thermal differential that hyperspectral sensors detect as plainly as a white truck on a black tarmac. The U.S. intelligence community now assesses, with high confidence, that it has mapped the complete layout of at least 14 major underground missile production and storage facilities, Some of these were previously unknown. Some were suspected but unconfirmed. Some were known in general terms but are now understood with an interior fidelity that enables the targeting of specific chambers, the room where the guidance systems are stored separately from the airframes, the specific corridor that connects the mixing plant to the casting chambers, the precise location of the command and control bunker relative to the ventilation exhaust. This is not satellite photography revealing that a door exists. This is a penetrative mapping capability that reveals what is behind the door, what is 3 levels below the door, and what is being moved through the door at 0300 local time on a Tuesday. Stay with me. Because this changes the targeting calculus in a way that most public analysis has not yet absorbed. For 2 decades, the U.S. military has known approximately where Iran's underground facilities are. The problem was never a lack of general coordinates. The problem was target characterization. A 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator dropped on a mountain does nothing if it hits 40 meters of granite above an empty storage chamber. The weapon must strike the specific section of the facility that contains the centrifuges, or the solid fuel mixing equipment, or the command personnel. Without that granularity, a strike is kinetic theater, impressive explosions that destroy geology rather than capability. With it, a single sortie by a B-2 Spirit carrying 2 MOPs can produce a mission kill on a facility that previously required an entire bomber wing, dropping dozens of weapons in a statistical hope of a lucky hit. The munitions required to neutralize Iran's underground network just dropped by an order of magnitude, and the U.S. Air Force has exactly 20 MOPs in its active inventory. Against a target set of 14 facilities with unknown internal geometry, that is insufficient. Against a target set of 14 facilities where the precise chamber location, depth, and rock composition above it are known to the meter, 20 weapons becomes, in the assessment of one war planner, more than adequate for a decapitation of the underground enterprise. This is the specific tactical reality that Iran's doctrine was not designed to survive. If you are following this conflict closely and want to go deeper on the satellite architecture that makes this possible, the membership program provides the extended analysis that goes beyond what fits in a public format. Members get the full technical breakdown of the synthetic aperture radar constellation, including orbital parameters, revisit rates, and the specific fusion algorithms that combine SAR data with signals intelligence to achieve the penetration mapping described here. If you want the full analysis rather than the summary, that is where to find it. Now we turn to the target set itself. Understanding what has been exposed requires understanding the 4-node architecture of Iran's solid fuel missile program. Node 1 is the mining and processing of raw materials, the ammonium perchlorate, the aluminum powder, the hydroxyl-terminated polybutadiene binder. These are produced at civilian adjacent chemical plants, mostly above ground, relatively easy to monitor. Node 2 is the mixing and casting facilities where these ingredients become solid rocket motor segments. This is the most dangerous industrial process in the missile enterprise, the most difficult to replicate, and the most concentrated in terms of infrastructure. The ERC has placed its primary mixing and casting complex at a site designated by the CIA as the Shahid Bakari Industrial Group, buried under 90 meters of granite in the Zagros foothills. This facility is the single point of failure. Iran has approximately 2,500 ballistic missiles in its active inventory, but if the mixing and casting capability at Shahid Bakari is destroyed, the production line for new missiles stops, not slows down, not gets disrupted, stops. And the specific chamber where the 600-gallon vertical mixers operate, massive German-designed industrial machines that have no domestic Iranian replacement, has now been mapped to within 3 meters of its exact location and 2 meters of its depth below the surface. Node 3 is the storage of completed rocket motors. Solid fuel motors degrade. The propellant grain cracks. The bond between the grain and the motor casing weakens. The ERC has solved this through climate-controlled underground storage chambers, kept at a constant 18 degrees Celsius and 40% humidity. The chambers are large enough to store approximately 200 assembled missiles each, arranged horizontally on rail-mounted cradles. The satellite architecture has identified the thermal signature of the climate control systems at 8 of these storage nodes. The exhaust vents, hidden in the folds of hillsides and masked by heat-reflective netting, show up on infrared as distinct plumes, 2 to 4 degrees warmer than ambient air, persisting even at night when surface temperatures drop. Node 4 is the launch infrastructure. Transporter erector launchers. Mobile. Constantly moving. the one element of Iran's deterrent that still retains meaningful survivability. But a TEL without a missile is a truck, and a missile without a solid fuel motor is a tube of metal. The mapping of nodes 2 and 3 means that the TELs at node 4, no matter how skillfully they are dispersed across 1.6 million square kilometers of Iranian territory, are being systematically starved of the weapons they exist to transport. Now let us steelman the Iranian position, because intellectual honesty demands we take their options seriously rather than dismissing them as empty bluster. The ERC is not ignorant of the satellite overflight schedule. They track the orbits. They know when the radar birds pass overhead, and they have constructed their defensive logic around 3 assumptions. Assumption 1. The U.S. will not strike first because the political cost of starting a war with Iran is prohibitive, and therefore the intelligence advantage remains a deterrent tool rather than an operational one. Assumption 2. Even if the U.S. does decide to strike, the sheer number of facilities, widely dispersed, deeply buried, some co-located with civilian infrastructure, creates a targeting dilemma that no amount of intelligence can fully solve without producing unacceptable collateral damage. Assumption 3. The surviving elements of the missile force, whatever percentage they might be, are sufficient to inflict devastating retaliation on U.S. bases, in the region and on Israel, and this retaliatory capability deters the strike in the first place. Deterrence is preserved even if concealment is lost, because the certainty of retaliation does not depend on the survival of all 2,500 missiles. It depends on the survival of perhaps 200. And surely, the Iranian logic goes, no American president can be confident of destroying every last one. The problem with this strategic logic is that every single one of these assumptions is being systematically undermined. Assumption 1. The U.S. will not strike first. This misreads the escalatory ladder. The U.S. does not need to conduct a surprise first strike on Iranian territory. The trigger will not be an American decision to initiate hostilities. The trigger will be a threshold event, the detonation of a nuclear test device, the expulsion of IAEA inspectors, the confirmed transfer of advanced missile technology to Hezbollah or the Houthis. At that point, the U.S. is not striking first. It is responding, and in that response, the target set is preloaded. The intelligence is live. The weapons are dialed in. This is not a theoretical exercise. Assumption 2. The targeting dilemma and collateral damage constraint. This assumption depends on the U.S. caring about the physical destruction of facilities rather than the functional destruction. A mixing and casting complex is not a hardened aircraft shelter. It is an industrial process that depends on a sequential chain of events. Raw materials enter, mixers operate, propellant slurry is cast, segments are cured. The U.S. does not need to destroy the mixers to break this chain. It needs to destroy the power supply, the ventilation system, the water cooling infrastructure, the access road that connects the facility to the outside. A handful of precision weapons, guided by the mapping that now exists, can render Shahid Bakari functionally inoperative without penetrating the burial depth at all. Collapse the primary ventilation shafts. Rupture the water mains. Crater the access tunnel entrance at its most narrow and geologically constrained point. The facility is not destroyed, it is entombed, and the collateral damage to civilian infrastructure above ground is zero, because there is no civilian infrastructure above ground. The site is in an isolated valley 47 kilometers from the nearest town. Assumption 3. Sufficient missile survival for retaliation. This is the most fragile assumption of all. The satellite mapping does not merely locate the missiles, it tracks their movement. The thermal signature of a TEL that has just been loaded with a missile is distinct from a TEL that is empty. The transport patterns from storage facility to launch dispersal area are now visible over time, analyzed across thousands of satellite passes. Pattern of life analysis has identified the specific roads, the specific times, and the specific dispersal locations that the Aerospace Force uses for its most survivable Ghadar 110 and Sejgil 2 units. In a conflict scenario, the U.S. is not hunting 2,500 missiles across all of Iran. It is hunting the estimated 300 missiles that are postured for an initial retaliatory salvo, because those are the only ones that are mated to their TELs, fueled and dispersed within 60 minutes of launch readiness. Take out those 300, and the follow-on salvos, even if the missiles survive, cannot be organized, cannot be coordinated, and cannot be launched before U.S. Follow-on strikes destroy the launch infrastructure. the retaliatory salvo collapses into a ragged series of disconnected, uncoordinated launches that Aegis cruisers and destroyers in the Persian Gulf eat for breakfast. The analogy is a chess player who has spent years building a beautiful, intricate opening strategy against a single opponent, only to discover on the day of the match that the opponent has been quietly reading every note, every practice game, every tactical study that the player thought was locked in a private safe. The player sits down, makes the first move, and the opponent counters immediately, not because the opponent is guessing, but because the opponent has already played this exact game 100 times in simulation. The Iranian chess player is still reaching for the rook. The American response is already on the board, and the Iranian player has just realized that the safe was never locked. The strategic implications for the next 72 hours, for the next phase of the standoff, revolve around what the airstrike does with the knowledge that its concealment is comprehensively compromised. The internal debate in Tehran splits between two factions that have existed since 1979 but are now in a state of active and consequential disagreement. The nihilistic faction, centered in the AirGC's External Operations Directorate, argues that if concealment is lost, the only remaining move is escalation. Disperse the mobile launchers to pre-surveyed launch positions. Place the force on a hair trigger alert. Make clear that any kinetic action will produce an immediate and overwhelming response before the last missile is destroyed. The pragmatist faction, centered in the civilian government and elements of the regular Artesh military, argues that the satellite mapping is a deterrent message in itself, a demonstration that further escalation produces only further exposure, and that the rational move is to slow walk the nuclear program, accept temporary constraints, and wait for the satellite architecture to develop a vulnerability that can be exploited. The pragmatist calculation is a cold one. Space-based radar constellations age. Orbits decay. Funding priorities shift. A reconnaissance architecture that is politically untouchable today may be defunded in 5 years. Iran has played the long game since 1979 and has outlasted American military presences in Lebanon, in Somalia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The nihilistic calculation is equally cold, but based on a different variable, the assessment that if Iran's missile deterrent is rendered impotent by persistent surveillance, the regime loses its only reliable instrument for preventing the United States and Israel from acting with impunity. A regime that cannot deter cannot survive. Therefore, the moment of maximum danger is the window between the loss of concealment and the moment that loss is demonstrated to be operationally consequential. Stay inside that window too long, and the deterrent evaporates. Act while still inside it, and the deterrent is validated. This brings us to the diplomatic dimension, which is running in the same sentence as the military one. The satellite mapping is not merely a targeting tool, it is a negotiating instrument. A U.S. negotiating team sitting in Vienna with detailed knowledge of the internal layout of Shahid Bakari does not need to threaten a strike to communicate the threat. The knowledge itself is the message. A casual reference to the mixing chamber ventilation system in a private diplomatic conversation, a remark that no public reporting has ever made, communicates with perfect clarity that the United States sees what Iran has built, knows where it is, and has already solved the targeting equation. This is the love tap principle of coercive diplomacy, a demonstration of capability so precise and so undeniable that it forces the adversary to recalibrate their assumptions without a shot being fired. The question is whether the recalibration produces de-escalation or panic. Both outcomes are possible. Both outcomes are being wargamed at U.S. Central Command right now. The next 72 hours are the compression zone. The satellite constellation is active. The intelligence is live and updating. The facilities are mapped. The underground corridors, their lengths, their depths, their ventilation profiles are cataloged in targeting folders that require only a presidential authorization to activate. The AIRC knows the satellites are overhead. The U.S. knows the AIRC knows. And somewhere in Tehran, in the sprawling complex of the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, analysts are calculating the specific depth of granite above each critical chamber and running the math on the penetration capability of the Gibu 57AB with its improved fuse delay programming. The AIRC missile force is exposed. The deception infrastructure is penetrated. The concealment strategy is void. And somewhere in the Pentagon, a targeting officer has already run the simulation so many times that the only variable left is the execute order. 3 questions remain unanswered. Will the pragmatist faction in Tehran succeed in using the Vienna negotiations as an off-ramp before the nihilistic faction forces an escalatory demonstration? Does the U.S. satellite architecture possess the persistence and the analytical bandwidth to maintain real-time custody of the mobile tel fleet if the Ergi shifts to a continuous displacement deployment pattern? And the hardest question of all, has the exposure of the underground network actually reduced the risk of war by clarifying the balance of forces, or increased it by backing Iran into a corner where the only remaining ambiguity is the will to launch? Nothing hides in the granite anymore. The mountain walls have been made of glass for months. Iran is just now realizing it. Subscribe and turn on notifications immediately, because the next 72 hours are the window in which the ERC either accepts the new reality or tests it. That is the development that every analysis of US-Iran confrontation will reference as the inflection point of this phase, the moment the concealment assumption died and the strategic architecture had to be rebuilt in the open. Drop your prediction in the comments right now. Does the Ergic escalate with a missile test or a proxy attack to re-establish deterrence? Or does it absorb the intelligence loss quietly and accelerate the nuclear breakout before the targeting becomes operational?